Good evening, teacher and classmates. Today we're going to talk about Native Son, a task presented by Jan Sanchez and Arley Paez. This is a book written by Richard Wright. So first of all, we would like to talk about Richard Wright, that he was born on September the 4th of 1908 in Natchez, Mississippi, and he died on November the 25th of 1960 in Paris, France. He was an African American writer. Um, Talking about his family, his mother was a country school teacher, and his father was an illiterate sharecropper, a poor farmer who shares land with other farmers. The family moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1914, and soon the father abandoned them. From then on, Richard's education was inconsistent, but he had attained experience beyond his years. He bounced from school to school and tried to make friends. Wright knew it was, Wright knew what it was to be a victim of racial hatred because of an event that happened with her aunt's husband, that he was lynched. Um, After the fact that his first job, the Voodoo of Hells of Half Acre, had been published in the local black paper, it set him apart from his classmates. At the age of 19, Wright decided he wanted to be a writer. He moved to Chicago, Illinois, where he had access to public libraries, and he was inspired by writers such as Fyodor Dostoevsky, Theodore Dreiser, Henry James, and William James. His interest in social problems generated a friendship with the psychologist Louis Wirth. When Richard's mother, brother, and aunt came to Chicago, he supported them as a postal clerk until the job ended in 1929. After months of living on public welfare, he got a job in the Federal Negro Theater Project, and he works uh, Progress Administration. Later, he became a writer for the Illinois Writers Project. Meantime, Wright had joined the John Gray Club, beginning an association with the Communist Party, a political party that believes goods and services should be owned and distributed by a strong central government. His essays, reviews, and short stories and poems appear regularly in communist papers, and by 1937, when he became Harlem editor of the Daily Worker, he enjoyed a considerable reputation in left-wing circles for novellas, that are short novels, published as Uncle Tom's Children in 1938, that introduced him to a large general audience. Talking about Native Son, that is the task that we're talking about today. So it was the first Wright's novel that was published in 1940, and it was a brutally honest description of black urban ghetto life that was immediate success. The story's protagonist or main character represents all the fear, rage, rebellion, spiritual hunger, and the undisciplined drive to satisfy it. The social psychologists were just beginning to recognize as common elements of the personality of poor people of all races. Wright's intention was to make the particular truth universal and to project his native son as a symbol of the poorly treated in all lands. Critics, however, impressed by the universal symbol, were interested instead of Wright's passionate criticism of white racism. Um, and the lifestyle it imposed upon African Americans. Wright believed that there was better way of social organization different from democracy, and that communism could be the best way. These ideas were toned down in the stage version in 1941. Wright also published 12 million Black Voices, a folk story of the Negro in the United States. In 1940, Wright had married and divorced, and a few months later of his second marriage, he broke with the Communist Party. His work "I Tried to Be a Communist", published in the Atlantic in 1944, was represented in 19 was reprinted in 1949 in The God Failed, edited by Richard Crossman. The break freed him from social commitments that were beginning to seem troublesome in Black Boy. fictionalist autobiography. His only commitment is to truth. The book was published in January of 1945 and sales reached 400,000 copies by March. Wright accepted an invitation from the French government to visit France and the 3 months experience in sharp contrast to his experience in his own country. Wright, his wife and daughter moved permanently to Paris, France. Within a year and a half, Wright was off to Argentina, where he started the film version of Native Son. That is the book that we're talking about today. The Outsider, the first of three novels written in France, was deeply influenced by existentialism, a philosophy that stresses the individual experience in the universe, whose most famous spokespersons, Jean-Paul Sartre, that was born in 1905, and Simone Beauvoir, that was born in 1908 as well, were Wright's closest friends. Following Savage Holiday in 1954, Pot Boiler, that is a book that is usually of poorer quality, written to make money. The Long Dim in 1958, that proved that Wright had been too long out of touch with the American reality to deal with effectively. None of the novels written in France succeeded. His experiments with poetry did not produce enough for a book. In 1953, Wright visited Africa, where he hoped to discover his roots as a black man. Black Power in 1954 combines the elements of a travel book with the passionate political treatise of formal writing on the completely different order of life. In Africa in 1955, he attended the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung, Indonesia, and published his impressions in the Colored Curtain in 1956. Plague in Spain in 1956, based on 2 months in Spain, is the best of his non-fiction works. White Men, Listen, 1958, is a collection of four long essays on white-colored East relations. In 1960, following an unhappy attempt to settle in England in midst of a rich lecture schedule, Wright fell ill. He entered a hospital in Paris on November the 55, and he died 3 days later. Eight Men in 1961 was published, and a collection of short stories in Load Today in 1963. A novel were published after his death. Talking also about the summary and the setting about this book. In this case, we're talking about like the way in which the story was created. It is like representing the story of man that lives in a African American family that was like with Mrs. Thomas, right? That was the mother of this family. Was all his sons that are bigger in also body, and her daughter that is Vera. In this case, Bigger is the protagonist of this story, in which he didn't have a job, and his mother asks him to go for a job. In this case, in the part of the story where her mother asks him to go for a job, we see how the setting in that moment is a setting of a family that all of them live in only one room, and in that case, they didn't have enough resources, that they had to turn left or turn right in order like to give privacy to the other relative in order to get dressed, because they didn't have enough space in order like to go to a private place and get dressed. No, they had to share the same place in only one group they lived. And also it shows how the weather condition at that moment was like that, because it was snowing and they had to wear a coat in order like not to get cold in the street. Well, Mrs. Thomas asked him to go for a job. Instead of that, he goes with his friends, and talking about his friends that are GH, Goose, and Jack. They plan for, I mean, for a robbery, and they go for a crime. So in this case, they go and rob a white business. And after that, he goes to the cinema with his friends, and then he remembers that he has to go to the job interview that his mother asks him. And he goes to that interview, he gets the job. The interview was about to be a driver, so he becomes driver for the family. And the family that he gets the job with is the Dalton's family, that is composed by Mary Dalton, that is the daughter of that family, the only daughter actually. That in this case, she is a university student, because in that case we see how in that type of environment white people have like the opportunity in order to have a better education, and black people, unfortunately, they didn't have like the opportunity for a university because they didn't have enough resources for that. So also we have Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Thomas, that are the father and mother, the parents of this family. And they give them the opportunity to they give him the opportunity to Bigger Thomas to start working as a driver. And we also have uh, the I mean the cook of that family, that is Piggy, that in this case, she is the one in charge of uh, helping Bigger with everything related with this. I mean, with his tasks about as a driver. So he's like the main boss, the direct boss in this case. So the first task that is given to Bigger was that he had to take Mrs. Thomas to the university. So he takes Mrs. Thomas to the university, but unfortunately on the way she tells him that he has to turn left, and that he doesn't want to go to the university, but he wants to go to the um, I mean, he wants to meet his boyfriend that at the end is a communist. And in that case, that communist, that his name is Jan Erlon, I mean, he tries to convince Bigger to be a communist as well, and in this case, tries to change his ideas. In that case, Mrs. Thomas, I'm sorry, Mrs. Dalton, in that case, is a communist as well. So she thinks as his boyfriend does, and they go to drink. They go for some drink, and she gets drunk. At the end, Bigger leaves on the way to Jen, and he takes Mrs. Dalton home, but she is very drunk. So he takes her to the room, and at that moment, because of Mrs. Thomas, that she is blind, in order not to be like punished for because he didn't follow the Mr. Thomas directions, he with a pillow, unfortunately, he kills Mary Dalton. So when he killed Mary Dalton, he tries to hide the murder. The murder, later on, he starts to try to hide everything. So the police try to make questions. Also, Mr. Thomas paid a private investigator in order to know what happened with that, and they talked to Bigger, and Bigger gave them like some references that directed to Jan Erlun as the murderer. But in this case, it was like everything planned by Bigger in order like not to be discovered. But later on, Bigger is discovered, unfortunately, because he tried to get the body on fire in the furnace of the house, and the police discovered that. Later on, the Bigger is in this case judged, and the punishment that he received is that he was gonna be killed. So in that case, we see how bigger that I mean, just for trying to get a job, just in order to obey, just in order to get like a better opportunity for him, accidentally he killed the person, and then he at the end he hates white more than he did. And in that case, we see like the big difference of those two scenarios between black and white. And also we see how talking about the setting, the luxurious house that rich people have that white people had, that is totally different to the conditions that black people had to live. Also, we see how the type of dress that they used is the dress is the dressing is the dress code of that time. Uh, Also for the police, also for the dress code, like that makes the difference between rich and poor people in this case. So, talking about like the setting, we may see how also the setting like gives a setting of the differences between like the traditional values and the communists, the young people trying to break with those traditional values, and also how black people are trying to survive as well and take his place, and how even technology gives or takes a place in this setting where only like rich people had a car, but that car was with the technology of that time or of that moment. So in that case, we see how it works as well. Um, Talking about like the characters for Bigger Thomas, as we have mentioned, so he is so a person that is just trying to survive, that he hates white people because he understands like the differences between white and black people at that moment, and he feels that people doesn't treat them as a normal person, as an equal. That was like the idea of that moment. Mary Delton, that is a communist that is trying to break in with the traditional values. Though she is, I mean, a rich person because she is from a millionaire family. John Erlon, that is a communist of that moment, that was trying as well to break with the traditional values and make people to think about like that the equal people and all the values and all the rights. Um, this Mears, that is Bigger's friend, that is like his girlfriend, but she is just trying to, I mean, survive, get enough money to live, and to get someone who helps her to get a better style life. Mrs. Thomas, that is a blind person that, though she tries with his husband, Mr. Thomas. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thomas, that is Bigger's mother, that is that is a religious person, that she believes in God. She tries to survive as well, but she wants the best for his son, but she understands how hard it is for black people at that moment to survive. uh, Barry Thomas and Vera Thomas, that they belong to the black community. They suffer the same of not having like enough resources to live. GH, Goose, and Jack, that they live as well with the black community, but in this case they chose the criminal way, just as an opportunity to have enough money or survive. Uh, Well, in this case, we also have like characters as Brittany is a racist, an anti-communist private investigator, that is investigator that was hired in order like to figure out everything about the disappearance. A book that is an incumbent state attorney for running a re-election. That Buckley is visually racist and anti-communist as well. Peggy, as we mentioned before, like is Dalton's a worker. In this case, she's the cook, and the dog, that is the black owner of the pool hall, that is outside is on the south of Chicago, that serves hangout for Bigger and his friends. So in that case, that we already talked about, like those characters that are the characters. related with this book. We're going to continue with Jan, that is going to talk about the symbols of this movie or of this book.
Native Son is full of symbolism. Let's go ahead and analyze four of them. The first one is the rat. The rat at the start of the novel is a reflection of Beggar himself. Notably, it is a black rat, not gray or brown. The rat has ended up in the apartment by chance, but once it was there, it represents a danger to the humans around it. In a similar way, Bigger's life has been guided by circumstance, and he is becoming a danger to the people around him. The rat scrambles to escape, even biting at Bigger's leg. A description of the rat in fear creates some sympathy for the creature, even though it remains a danger that must be removed. Bigger's oppressive life may create some sympathy for him, but it doesn't make him less dangerous either. Ultimately, the rat is crushed by a force beyond its control, Bigger and the frying pan. In the same way, Bigger is crushed by the force of white society at the end of the story. A second symbol is blindness. Mrs. Dalton is literally blind, which keeps her from seeing her daughter's antics or ultimately the danger Mary is during her last moments. Mrs. Dalton is also symbolically blind to the suffering of the black people she claims to help and to the injustice that has built her husband's fortune. Furthermore, her blindness reflects the blindness of all white society to the suffering of the black community and the ways they benefit from segregation. White society in the book fails to see the abject poverty and racial injustice committed before his very eyes. A third symbol is the snow. The night Mary's murder is discovered by the journalist and Bigger escapes. A snowstorm hits Chicago. Snow, of course, is white, just like the people who are trying to find Bigger. Unlike those people, the snow prevents Bigger's escape. Bigger is forced to hide in an abandoned building because the snow prevents him from finding any kind of transportation out of the city. The cold and snow leads Bigger to a top tower in the building where he is washed over with water and finally captured. If there had been no snow that night, he might have remained outside on the run and probably escaped. The snow encompasses everything in the city, just like white society who prevents black people from escaping from that reality. A fourth symbol in the novel is the cross. The Christian cross traditionally symbolizes compassion and sacrifice for a greater good. And indeed, Biggie's mother intends as much when she gives Bigger a cross while she's in jail. Bigger even begins to think of himself as Christ-like, imagining that he's sacrificing himself in order to wash away the shame of being black, just as Christ died to wash away the world's sins. Later, however, after Bigger sees the image of a burning cross outside of his cell, he can only associate crosses with the hatred and racism that have crippled him throughout his life. As such, the cross in Native Son comes to symbolize the opposite of what it usually signifies in a Christian context. So body quotation in the novel gives us a hint of what was it like to be living in Chicago as a black American and white American in the 1930s. The first quotation states, "Every time I get to think about me being black and they being white, me being here, they being there, I feel like something awful is going to happen to me." Bigger. In this quotation, we can see how Bigger realizes that his fate is tied intimately to the color of his skin. His choices are limited by the white citizens surrounding the south side of Chicago, even though he has almost no interaction with them. Though his friend Gus tells him to stop thinking about it, Bigger's onto something. He realizes that he's trapped in a world where white people dictate what he can and can't do, where he can and can't go. He doesn't even have enough money to get drunk about it because, once again, white people have denied him a decent paying wage for living. A second quotation gives us a perspective from the white American side of the story. I've been to England, France, and Mexico, but I don't know how people lived in blacks for me. We know so little about each other. Mary. In that quotation, we can see how Mary acknowledges the tragedy of segregation in the city and the society, but she doesn't fully grasp how little she understands the reality of it, and how dangerous her lack of understanding truly is. A third quotation states, "Please, don't let him kill my boy. You know how mother feels. Please, ma'am, we live in your house. They don't ask us to move. We ain't got nothing. Mrs. Thomas." In this quotation, we can see Mrs. Thomas's reality. She reveals her powerlessness with regard to the situation her son is living. Her revelation makes Bigger feel the same shame he always feels when he realizes that he has no power in the society. A final quotation states, "I didn't know I was really alive in this world until I felt things hard enough to kill for him." Bigger. And that quotation, it's the final moments before execution. Bigger is recognizing that his life was so bleak that his crimes were the only thing that made him have true feelings about something. But basically, he was living in a world where he was banned from feeling, he was banned from understanding the context and the role that he was playing in it. Modernism as a literary period is characterized by a sense of modern life through art as a sharp break from the past, a sharp break from Western civilization's classical traditions, a more scientific, faster, more technological, and more mechanized context, and vision and viewpoint that became an essential aspect of the modernist novel. Richard Wright's Native Son uh, is sometimes categorized as African American protest literature or ethnical modernism. We can see that some of the main features of modernism are included within the novel. First, it exhibits perspectivism. Individual perspectives are represented several times throughout the novel. Bigger Thomas, as the novel hero, continuously expresses his vision of life under the oppression he and his family lived in Chicago of the 1930s. His hatred toward the life he has to live as an African American is personalized in his hate, frustration, and shame. Mrs. Thomas' perspective is also put in evidence at the moment Bigger is presented before Mr. and Mrs. Dalton, when she tries to convince Mrs. Dalton to feel her pain as a mother and prevent her son from being sentenced to death. Mrs. Dalton as well has a chance to speak her meaning from her own perspective when she meets Bigger for the first time and presents herself as a white, charitable, and compassionate woman. A second characteristic is inner psychological reality is represented also in the novel. Bigger psychological reality is one of the central themes in the story. As a character, he is depicted as someone who is extremely mad about himself and his reality, ashamed of being who he is, and lost to his own identity. His struggle to survive in a white society that has already condemned him by the color of his skin is seen when he is free to speak among the wrongs, but also when he is before the oppressors. As a novel hero, his consciousness speaks out his actions, and in the hidden words that he pronounces. Other characteristic is the perception of language changes. Language has a full variety of representations in the novel. From a literal viewpoint, African American vernacular is used plainly to create characters' identity who live in the South Side as Black African Americans. On the other hand, the narrator's language as well as the white characters show the contrast between the two worlds living in the same city. The novel language is full of meaning not only from the linguistic viewpoint but also from a semantic context. Other characteristic is the emphasis on the experimental. Even though the story follows a continuous series of events, experimentation is seen in the novel as fragmentation between the two lives Bigger Thomas has to play in his two roles as segregated African American and murderous individual hidden under the mask of vulnerable community member whose life is continuously in the struggle. And a final characteristic is the ambiguous endings or open endings, which are seen as more representative of reality. Native Son was an important depiction of 20th century racism and its consequences. Uh, in this novel, Wright showed more than the injustice inherent at the time, but uh, the great problems the systems was creating between the oppressors and the oppressed. Those who were oppressed were not novel victims, but rather people, and racism created systems where neither side could see the others as human beings with wants, desires, and faults to their own. Native Son's protagonist, Bigger Thomas, faces this very problem. He's unable to see white people as people, but just as a simple device of oppression. He wants a better life, but he cannot accept the help that comes from the radicals who wish to challenge the system because he cannot understand them, just as they do not understand him on his position as a black African American who committed murder under his own considered presence by the system. The ending on the novel is continuously open to different final stages. One where he's sentenced to death and at some point liberated from the reality, and in the other one when he's pardoned and sentenced to life, but had to continuously live as a black African American subject to the oppression of the white society. There is a connection between Marxist literary theory and Native Son. Marxist literary theories tend to focus on the representation of class conflict as well as the reinforcement of class distinctions through the medium of literature. Marxist theories often champion authors sympathetic to the working classes and authors whose work challenges the economic inequalities found in capitalist societies. And Native Son uh, Wright shapes the novel to a certain extent by his own experiences with the Communist Party of the United States, first in Chicago and then when he was in Harlem. But whatever commitment to the party Wright may have felt in the early 1930s is hardened at the end of the decade by his depiction of the nightmare of Bigger Thomas' life. Uh, for writing the novel, Wright imagines a communism in the United States that's quite capable of reproducing processes of social dehumanization that exile Bigger into the shadow role, what he once called, ironically, the Negro's uncertain position in America. The very first notion of communist ideology in Native Son is brought to light when the character of John Erlon appears. John Erlon is the lover of Mary Dalton, who works for the Labor Defender Office, and who also happens to be white. Jan, Mary, and Bigger eat dinner in one of Bigger's haunts, and Jan doesn't feel out of place. For Mary, the dinner is important because it gives her the chance to see if black people live how she does. We can find that as also representations of Marx's theory of alienation, which is a result of capitalism, uh, directly when people are alienated from aspects of their human nature, represented within the book. Bigger is also caught up with the differences between black and whites, that he has become alienated, and the thought of having white friends is just, it appears detestable to him. Bigger's killing of Mary is not something intentional, but is presented as a direct result of this alienation that he feels. In fact, Bigger never regrets what happened. He actually sees it as some kind of personal success, and he tries to benefit from the whole thing by faking a kidnapping and making some money out of it. As we can see, there was a strong relation between Marx's literary theory and Native Son, but basically put into the novel because of the personal experience of Richard Wright's uh, communist ideology and participation in the party in the United States.